So I want to talk to you guys a little bit today about some research that I guess developed out of my last project about black resistance to British policing. And it emerged out of some of the archival documents that I managed to get hold of with the help of a friend called Chris Johnson, based in the US, which are the newspapers of a Black Power organisation here in Britain called the Black Unity and Freedom Party, which were active in the 1960s and 70s. And in these newspaper articles, I found a number of quite interesting analyses of two different manifestations of British nationalism and British racism. On the one hand, there were, I think, quite familiar, and maybe both of them are familiar depending on what you've been reading, familiar for me critiques of British state racism and critiques of the first iterations of state or state-sanctioned approaches to anti-racism. So parliamentary select committees on so-called race relations, and the kind of the genesis of the kind of race relations industry. But the other things that I found in these newspaper articles, which I particularly began to find interesting last summer, where we first saw the kind of big kind of fascist and proto-fascist mobilisations outside the so-called hotels, which were being used to house undocumented people, were the accounts and opinion editorials relating to resistance to British fascism. And I wanted to explore both these aspects of these archival materials and think through some of the ways in which both the historical accounts, but crucially as well the analysis of the Black Unity and Freedom Party can prove useful in making sense of our current political moment. Right, so without further ado. So I want to talk a little bit about institutional racism, a little bit about the McPherson reports and how it kind of emerges in relation to the Black Power movement, and then a little bit about where we're at today. Okay. So the analysis, of course, that the Black Power movement in Britain has of of British racism and British nationalism is embedded in two fundamental, I guess, political traditions. One of them, of course, is a politics of anti-colonialism, and it's probably encapsulated best, I think, in this slogan here, "We did not come alive in Britain," which was the title of both a speech and later an article by John LaRose, who published it here in Race Today, in which he makes the case that for many black people, and here he's referring to people of South Asian as well as African and Caribbean heritage residing in Britain, their first experiences of British racism wasn't here on the British mainland. Their first experiences of British racism were through the experiences of colonisation. And of course, those experiences of British racism were not the kind of interpersonal slights or prejudicial remarks, or I guess it's fashionable to say microaggressions. Do people still say that on the internet? I don't know. Don't use the internet enough. But their experiences of British racism were fundamentally linked with the state. So the British colonial judicial systems, the British colonial policing systems, the British military, which of course were brought on to the islands like Trinidad and Jamaica in the 1930s to quell strikes and other forms of working class and anti-colonial rebellion. And of course, British colonial capital. We see, of course, the plantations, the mines, the docks, the mills, the factories were all, of course, owned by British colonial capital at this time. And so people's experiences of British racism was fundamentally linked with these histories of colonisation and chattel slavery, were fundamentally linked with the states, of course, the colonial states, the police, the judiciary, the military, the tax collectors and other forms of the colonial administration, and of course fundamentally linked with British capital, right? The forms of exploitation experienced in, as I've mentioned, the mines, the plantations, the docks, the mills, the factories. And so it was upon arriving in Britain that many of these colonial and post-colonial migrants begin to experience racism on the British mainland. That this analysis required shifting only in as far as they began to experience British racism not simply from capital and the state, but also from the British working class. Right? This is what required an additional analysis, according to John LaRose, that that these migrants were unprepared for, experiencing racism from their neighbours, experiencing racism from their co-workers. In other words, experiencing racism from people who otherwise would have been their class allies. And it's here that we therefore see the emergence of an analysis of British fascism or British other forms of street racism. Stuart Hall and his colleagues kind of, I guess, theorised this quite coherently when they talked about Britain's, I guess, what later becomes known as racial capitalism. Right, where they talk about, in Policing the Crisis, they talk about racism as a process in which economic, political and ideological factors converge. They elaborate on this by saying that what is principally governed of the flow of black labour are the rhythms and requirements of British capital. In other words, in the post-war boom period, black labour is required and so therefore is absorbed into the economic system within the British the British mainland. And then, of course, in the 1970s and 80s, when Policing the Crisis is being written and we see a recession, or we see capitalism going through a crisis, then we see black labour becoming surplus, right? And therefore, black labour is a fluid and endlessly variable factor in British industry, as is the growth of racism. And this, of course, plays a really important role in the British state being able to reaffirm or re-establish its legitimacy in a period of crisis. And of course, it is this period of crisis in the 1970s that we see the rise of British fascism, principally through organised forms such as the National Front. For the interest of time, I might skip some slides, but we'll see how it goes. Okay. So, maybe I'll say a little bit about this one first. So, I've talked about this one before, so apologies if you've heard me talk through it, but I think it's really important and quite instructive. So this is the front page of one of the Black Unity and Freedom Party's newspapers. I think it's from 1973, if I remember correctly. And in it, you can see two or three things that I think are really important. The first is an analysis of the government's one of the first immigration bills, and they refer to it as a slave's charter. And I think this is arguably quite hyperbolic, right? They're saying, this is a return to a form of chattel slavery. However, I think it's quite instructive as well. And the reason I think it's quite instructive is because their understanding of racism as fundamentally linked to capitalism is a process in which capitalism uses racism to differently exploit differently racialised workers. So in the context of Trinidad, for instance, you would have had black workers who are capital, who are enslaved through chattel slavery. You will have indentured workers, right, who are differently enslaved, right, but not in the same way as chattel slaves. You will have white workers who earn a wage, and then of course you'll have the owners of British capital, right, colonial capital. And through this immigration bill, I think we can also understand British capitalism as using these forms of legislation to differently exploit different types of worker. And the reason, of course, for that is because what these immigration bills did was it meant that a section of British society were now living not as British citizens, with their British passports, freely able to move across the Commonwealth, but rather living as undocumented migrants, right, for the first time in recent history. And it's this movement into being undocumented migrants that we see people being differently exploited, only having certain forms of employment open to them. Similarly, therefore, at this very same time, we also see Britain attempting to recruit more black people into the police force. And of course, they saw this as an absurdity, but crucially, they saw this as a way of cloaking forms of British racism. They said that clearly the British state is attempting to re-establish forms of differentiation through these immigration bills, and that they were attempting to cloak this state's racism by making the agents of the state, the police, more racially diverse. Okay. But of course, as I mentioned, the other forms of British nationalism and British racism that the Black Unity and Freedom Party were analysing was the grassroots, was at the grassroots, was the more spontaneous forms of street racism that was being experienced by Black and Asian communities in the 1970s. One of the accounts that I came across in these newspapers was an account of racial violence in Leeds. And so here you can see the headline published by the Black Unity and Freedom Party, which reads, "Hunt down the petrol bombers." So the article reads, I've just got a small quote from it here that I've transcribed because the quality was so bad. As a result of the dispersal policy being carried out by a number of local councils, so this is a policy in which certain council estates in places like Leeds, but we also see it here in London, were considered by local councils to have too many black people living in one particular council estate, or too many Black and Asian people. And so the policy of dispersal was to rehouse Black and Asian families to other council estates where there were relatively few Black and Asian people living. And this was ostensibly a progressive policy to prevent ghettoisation in particular cities like Leeds and London, right? And therefore an attempt to ostensibly avoid the forms of ghettoisation that we'd seen in places like the United States. But of course, what this led to was Black and Asian families being isolated on these predominantly white council estates, and thus leading them to being more vulnerable to forms of racial violence, as we see here. The account goes on to describe how, like the Ku Klux Klan, the fascists struck late in the night. At 1 o'clock in the morning, a petrol bomb was thrown through the living room of the Richards home. It immediately set fire to the building. Luckily, Mrs. Richards was still awake. This was not the first time the family had been bombed. A similar incident occurred in August 1971. Leeds police, famous for the murder of David Olawale, took no action. So here, of course, we see this particular instance of racial violence being arguably in quite a hyperbolic way being described in the article, but I think drawing parallels with forms of grassroots fascist mobilisation like the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, I think is quite instructive here. I think it's useful partly because it draws on analyses of American fascism, particularly those popularised in the 1930s with the work of people like George Padmore, who analyse American fascism through analyses of the Ku Klux Klan, but also crucially think about the different ways in which these forms of racial violence aren't simply forms of prejudice or discrimination, or I guess it's popular today to say hate crime, but are linked to an ideology, right? Linked to an ideology of nationalism, of racism, and potentially of fascism as well. The response of the Black Unity and Freedom Party is as follows. He says, we must hunt down the petrol bombers and deal our own justice to them. If we do not, they will continue to bomb us, and the police and the government will continue to do nothing. It goes on to say, if you can read this quite grainy scan, is that we understand what British justice means for black people, right? And so here we see in a very explicit way the Black Union Freedom Party simultaneously rejecting proposals from the state, from the governments, that their newly diversifying police force should be the avenue through which Black and Asian people attain both safety and justice in the face of racial violence. But crucially as well, and again, arguably hyperbolic, but I think quite important, I guess emotive manner, we see the Black Unity and Freedom Party call for forms of community self-defense. And of course, that is exactly what we see emerging in the 1970s and up until the 1980s. These forms of community self-defense become integral for resistance to fascist organisations like the National Front, as well as more sporadic forms of racial violence. And I've just picked a few key examples here, which I think are really, really important. So one of them is, of course, the Battle of Lewisham in 1977, in which we see the National Front being confronted in South London. And for me, this was really important because after the first wave of fascist mobilisations that we saw in the summer of last year, I remember speaking to some young people at an FE college in Clapton called B6 College about what had taken place, and they said, it's really bad what's happened. It's really, it's really terrible, but it could never happen here, though, could it? It could never happen here in Hackney. It could never happen. Could it happen here, really, in London? I can't really imagine that happening. And part of me felt disappointed that these young people were not necessarily familiar with these histories of anti-fascism in places like East London and North East London, in places like South London, in Lewisham, and of course West London in Southall. But a part of me felt heartened because maybe this is what it looks like when we win. When the next generation of young people not only feel safe from fascist mobilisations, right, mass fascist, but feel it is inconceivable that the fascists could march through Clapton or through Whitechapel or through Wood Green or Tottenham or Walthamstow or Southall. Maybe this is also symptomatic of how deep-seated those victories of the 1970s and 80s were. Right? Or Lewisham, of course, right? Because the generation that comes up. So there is a loss here, I think, right? It is not a positive thing that of those histories necessarily haven't been passed down to the next generation. But I think there is something remarkable about how deep-seated those victories were, right? And of course, in the summer of this year, we saw attempts by the fascists to mobilise in cities, in areas across London, right? And those attempts at mobilisation were either massively outweighed by the anti-fascist mobilisations or didn't materialise at all, right? And I think that isn't simply a result of people mobilising in 2025 against the fascists. I think that is a legacy of those histories, which is important for us to return to and learn from. Okay. So, if those histories haven't necessarily been as enduring in their legacies with regard to how they're remembered, what other lessons have potentially been lost? Is what I began to think through and wonder. And through those, through asking those questions, I began to do a few interviews of people involved in anti-fascist movements in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s. And through those interviews, particularly through people involved in the monitoring group, so what was formerly the Southall Monitoring Project, as well as people involved in some of the campaigns in Oldham, Bradford and Burnley in 2001, there were two processes or two kind of phenomena that I began to identify. One of them was a really positive lesson, and one of them was perhaps a more negative one. So the more negative lesson I identified was, I guess, something I've talked about before, which was the forms of state-sanctioned anti-racism that emerged out of the public inquiry into the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993. And I've talked about this before, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but what we essentially found that arose out of this was that there was a quite profound misreading of institutional racism and state racism that emerged out of that inquiry. So while the activists which were involved in this particular form of anti-fascist organising against here was really the British National Party, but other forms of street racism that led to the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993, connected these forms of street racism and proto-fascism to wider structures of state power and state racism. What the state did was, whether it was intentional or not, I think it's beside the point, is reinterpret institutional racism. And through that reinterpretation of racism, what they did was they reinterpreted racism not as a fundamental component of the British state, of British capitalism, but rather a failure of state institutions, a failure to provide a professional service due to prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, or stereotyping. And what this lesson, I think, in anti-fascism and anti-racism did was demonstrate how the state is able to co-opt radical interpretations of state racism. Because, of course, as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, the analysis of these Black Power movements was that actually British racism was a fundamental part of the state. It was a fundamental part of British capital. And the prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and stereotyping that we see in Britain is something which is an outcome of state racism, right? It is an outcome of Britain's structures of racial capitalism. But for the Macpherson report, which came out of this inquiry into public inquiry into the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, it is prejudice, thoughtlessness, and stereotyping which is the input, right, which leads to the state becoming or state institutions becoming institutionally racist. But the second, and I won't go into too much detail about that because I think people are probably familiar with, of course, what this has led to, right? This has led to a set of state-sanctioned anti-racist policies which seek to either diversify away, educate away, or create some kind of accountability processes, right, to do away with the prejudice, the ignorance, the thoughtlessness, and the stereotyping, thus leaving British institutions, be they British capital or British state institutions, to operate in the fair, objective, non-racist manner as that they were intended to, right? Before they had been sullied by the prejudice, the ignorance, the thoughtlessness, or the stereotyping of the people that were working there. And of course, no institutions have done this more more effectively than, of course, the most powerful sections of British capital, right? Who wave pride flags and do Black History Month and all that good, and endorse Black Lives Matter and all of that good stuff. And of course, some of the most reactionary parts of the British state, whether it be the Conservative government or, of course, even Reform UK as well. And so, thinking through these failures, I also wanted to try to think through what were some of the more positive, what were the more some of the more affirmative lessons that were learned from these campaigns. And I think for me, some of the most affirmative lessons that were learned came not simply in the victories of the 1980s, but those in 2001. So I'm sure most people here are familiar, but just in case you're not, in 2001, there were a series of violent racist mobilisations against particularly Pakistani and Bangladeshi young people in Burnley, Bradford and Oldham, right? Former mill towns in the north of England. And these mobilisations were led to counter-mobilisations, galvanising young people to respond in kind, to defend their homes, their businesses, their places of worship, their communities from these forms of fascist mobilisation. And unsurprisingly, when the police intervened in this clash between the predominantly Pakistani and Bangladeshi community and the organised proto-fascism in 2001 in these three former mill towns, large numbers of young Pakistani and Bangladeshi people were arrested and charged with quite serious offences. And the accounts that I got from the people I interviewed, principally people involved with Southall Monitoring Project and the monitoring group, was quite instructive. So once these young people had been arrested, the advice that many of them were given by duty solicitors, but also by the generally self-appointed community leaders, often associated with relatively conservative religious institutions and or sections of local government, advised them all to plead guilty to the charges that the police had put upon them. They are generally charges of violent disorder, affray, so arguably possibly quite lengthy custodial sentences. And this was obviously frustrating for a lot of local activists, of course, because in the 1980s, organisations like the United Black Youth League in Bradford and the Asian Youth Movement, of course, successfully campaigned on a platform of self-defence is no offence, in which a significant number, 12 or 13 actually in the end, young people in Bradford were found not guilty of defending themselves from racial violence. And people from the monitoring group and Southall Monitoring Project went to these big community meetings, and because they were not from Bradford, Burnley and Oldham, they didn't have, of course, the kind of authority or platform to make the case for self-defence. And these more conservative community leaders ended these big public meetings by saying, we are going to encourage all of these young people to plead guilty in the hope that they will receive lesser sentences and learn the lessons from these crimes or forms of harm that they have committed. Upon leaving these meetings, on their way out, the people from the monitoring group said they were stopped by a number of women from the local community who hadn't really been contributing very much to the conversations. And they said, can we hold a second meeting, please, with you guys? And so they held a second meeting, principally in Bradford, but people from Oldham and Burnley attended as well. And in this second meeting, they agreed that these young people should change their plea from guilty to not guilty. In the end, they convinced 11 young people to change their plea from guilty to not guilty, to appeal their case on grounds of self-defence. They used the same lawyers that they had used for the Lawrence campaign, the same legal teams, who, for them, drew on three important lessons from the 1980s. The first was having a political as well as legal case for self-defence, making the jury aware not simply of the legal right to self-defence, but the wider political context of racism that was being experienced by young Pakistani and Bangladeshi people in Bradford, Burnley and Oldham at this time. The second thing that was really important was that they enabled these young people to make decisions for themselves as to whether they wanted to plead guilty or not, without pressuring them too much one way or the other. And the third thing that was really important was for the legal team to take the lead from the community, not the other way around, right? For there to be a really important, for the campaign to be a learning exercise for the legal team as well. And based upon those three really important principles, all of the young people who changed their plea from guilty to not guilty, appealed their case, got off. They were released from prison, and this was a really important, and I think understudied and under-recognised victory following the rebellions of 2001 in Bradford, Burnley and Oldham. And so, crucially here, even in a context in which racism is rife in these towns in the north of England, a jury, majority white jury, will, in both these historic cases in the 1980s and in the early 2000s, find these young people not guilty on the grounds of self-defence, right? And I think this is for me a really important lesson in thinking through both the limitations of state institutions with regard to how effective they can be in being a tool for anti-racist mobilisations. We see through this liberalising of anti-racism through the Macpherson report, but how in certain circumstances legal tools can be utilised as a defence for our young people, right? If we, in a strategic way, combine them with community campaigns, with, I guess, movement lawyers, which are willing to take instruction and support and leadership from community organisations, and as well as the kinds of historical memory, right, that can demonstrate the possibility of young people pleading not guilty, making the case for self-defence, making a political as well as legal argument in the courtroom, and thus setting further legal precedents for the, I think, increasing urgency of self-defence against fascist mobilisation in 2025. I think I'll leave it there, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So it's 12:37, and I'm sure you guys have some questions. I surely do. So I'll just open to the public first. Yeah? Would you like to start, Shadeen?
Yeah, is that okay? I'm just intrigued by these photographs. It's wonderful, and thank you so much for such an engaging talk. So my question to you is really not about that time, but this time. But in the context of that particular photo, which is United Black Youth League Bradford, and all the people standing underneath it seem to me to be of Asian background origin, right? So one of the things that's been intriguing me is, like, when did blackness become bifurcated into brownness and other elements of accuracy rather than politics, and what's your view?
So, to be honest, I don't think brownness is the way in which racism is articulated in 2025. I think it's Muslimness.
Well,
So I was in Bradford 2 weeks ago. I did a workshop at Bradford College, and then in a couple of different community spaces, mainly speaking to a mixture of older activists, but mainly young people. And I think the young people who are principally Pakistani, but also Bangladeshi heritage in Bradford, who would have identified as black in the 1970s, today identify as Muslim. And I think in 2001, maybe they would have been Asian, right? So we're seeing these different ways in which I guess racism is being articulated, like an anti-black racism, right, in the 1970s, and an anti-Asian racism in the 2000s. And then certainly post 9/11, right, it becomes articulated as an anti-Muslim racism. And so I think part of that is a response to how racism is being articulated. And so people begin to identify with the label that is being projected upon them, right? So you people are all Muslims. That's why there's a problem with you. It's like, yeah, we are Muslim, right? And what, right? And actually, that is the basis of our solidarity now, right? Or we are all black, and that is the basis of our or we are all whatever it might be. So I think part of it is I don't want to say a dialectic, right? But like it is a response to the ever-changing nature of racism. But I think that's also something which isn't just a national question, right? It's also something that's international, right? The war on terror as it emerges in the 2000s and not creates, but recalibrates the spectre of the Muslim as being this kind of racial category, is of course a global one, right? And I think it plays a really integral role in articulating a form of anti-imperialism as well. And I'm still thinking through the ways that this is in conversation with the kind of black power politics of the 1970s, which was simultaneously a response to a kind of anti-black racism in 1970s Britain, but also an internationalism of black power, right? That we see articulated through the work of people like Walter Rodney, right? Or the work of people like Steve Biko, who think about blackness in this kind of third worldist sense as well. I'm loath to. Well, of course, we can't simplistically say, Muslim is the new black, even though I do sometimes say that when I'm down the pub and having an argument with people. But there is something, I think, important about that moment, about this moment, which speaks to a response to both forms of modern imperialism, but also the kind of the cutting edge of racism as well. And I wouldn't be surprised as well if people, like myself, who are second generation, or my children who are third generation, start just identifying as immigrants. They're like, look, we're immigrants. Because this is also the way in which racism is being articulated now. Are you British or are you an immigrant, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if, the next generation said, we're all immigrants. Even if it was my grandmother who came here, do you know what, I'm an immigrant, because that is how racism is being articulated now. I don't know.
I see another hand there. I don't know. Shall we try to get two?
Oh yeah, because I talk a lot. Sorry. Yeah.
No. It's more to they might kind of coalesce, basically.
Yeah. And also, these are all things I'm thinking through, which is probably why my answers are not very well formulated. Sorry. Yeah.
No, it's bang on. My daughter's mixed heritage, and increasingly, people are sort of coming up to her and saying, "You Muslim," just on the basis of the colour of her skin. There's an assumption it's projected. Yeah,
we should say yes. No, I'm joking.
So if I can move to you and you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, that was interesting. Maybe just more of an observation than a question. So when I looked at these, I remember living through all this, and there was that sort of concept of political blackness, which had its roots in post-colonialism and anti-racism in history, but also it was a way of coming together. And that then led to the success in our younger people having a bit of comfort over these last few years. But I don't see that happening so much now, possibly. So in this last few months, I'm from Hull originally, and last year we had these anti-Muslim racist riots. Hull was one of the places that happened. But there was no solidarity from across the country. People weren't coming to Hull to back us up. Although it has happened a little bit, especially across London, there's been support, but not a lot. So I'm wondering if there's something to think about this political blackness coming back. There's a need for it to come back. So.
Shall we just connect another one?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Also, I'm so sorry, I forgot to ask you guys to introduce yourselves and asking a question. So,
right. I'm Michael, I'm a third year PGI in Southampton. And I use anti-blackness in my work to interrogate climate policy and things.
Thank you. Sorry.
I'm Paddy, I'm a PhD student at Queen Mary. And yeah, I'm just wondering, I think you've really brilliantly sort of pulled out these, political approaches to law and to the judiciary, in anti-racist struggle. But it seems it seems quite apparent to me that right now the far right have their own quite successful critique of law and of the courts. And we see, they have their own political prisoners and two-tier justice. And I mean, obviously it's, one's instinct is to just dismiss this as reactionary and wrong, but it seems to be quite effective as a sort of mobilizing tool, right? So I guess, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on how the state is responding to that, to the, this attack by the far right on the courts, and sort of how anti-racists should be responding to that attack as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Okay, so I don't think political blackness is coming back. I mean, I don't think anything from history is coming back. Nothing from history ever comes back, right? Every time something that we think from history has come back, it emerges in a different form, right? I don't want to get onto all that conjunctural analysis, right? But yeah, we live in a different time, and I think that's fine. What I do think, though, yes, is that we need to think through the different ways in which people, I guess, experience racism, how they therefore come into politics, whether it be through anti-Muslim racisms, right? Whether they're racialised as Muslim or whether they're actually Muslim, or both, right? And these things are fluid and what have you, or through the kind of anti-migrant racisms, right? Which I guess anti-migrant racism is simultaneously one of the most popular forms of racism, and also it is simultaneously anti-black and anti-Arab and anti-Asian and all of these things, right? And I think arguably for me, what feels like the biggest barrier is the attempt by both the liberal and certain parts of the far right to distinguish between who is the black or Asian citizen who is legal and is okay, right? The good immigrants, bad immigrants, right? Who's able to be the chair of Reform UK, right, or whatever, or the leader of the Conservative Party or whoever they might be, and then the bad immigrants, right? The people who need to be deported, right? We see this and perhaps, and I've written about this before, but perhaps this is most clearly articulated through the kind of liberal, pearl clutching over the so-called Windrush scandal, right? These people paid their taxes. They were invited by the Queen. Oh, can you believe it, right? Right, and but the national group which is most deported from Britain are Ghanaians, right? But there's no Ghana scandal, right? Because they haven't migrated through this respectable, grainy footage of them coming off, the Windrush in their suits, rebuilding the nation after World War II, all of this kind of jingoist nationalism, right? And I think it's trying to cut through this attempt to separate differently racialised or people who migrate through different channels that I think for me is the biggest impediment, right, to solidarity. And I think we really have to, the whole Windrush scandal thing I think is terrible, terrible politics, because it really separates from literally the next generation of young people who end up getting a custodial sentence for selling a bit of weed and get deported back to Jamaica, right? Which is what we're seeing with the children of the Windrush generation, right? Who are not part of this kind of respectability politics of the so-called Windrush generation. So that's what I'd say. The thing about fascists and their critique of the judiciary, again, of course, this is not new, right? I'm going to try and not talk about fascism and refer to the Nazis, right? But we see all iterations of the thing. One of the big kind of defining features of fascism is that it's ostensibly anti-establishment, right? They have this critique of the establishment figures, whether it be principally kind of liberal institutions like the judiciary. I guess if we think about the National Front in the 1970s, I mean, they had a critique of capital. But they were we were against immigrants and the bankers, right? And of course, the left had to be oh, we're also against the bankers, but not like you, right? And so, yes, I think we have to own the fact that, yes, we also have both the fascists and the left have a critique of liberal institutions, right? They have a critique of Keir Starmer, right? We all think Keir Starmer is a wanker, right? But for different reasons, right? And I think that's fine, right? And we have to work through those nuances and also work through the fact that many working class communities in Britain are frustrated with the criminal legal system and are frustrated with the Labour Party, right? And it's about winning those arguments as to what those frustrations are. Why are we so angry? Why do we feel a lack of safety within our community, right? And what does that lack of safety arise from, right? Is it because of like the woke judges, or is it because like our public services have been like depleted, right? And why is it we all hate Keir Starmer? Right? Is it because you're right? Is it because he just like loves immigrants and asylum seekers so much, or is it because he's like this like horrendous like robots? Right? So I think it's about realising that yes, the fascists, like the left, will have a critique of liberal institutions, but the question is, in what ways are our critiques different, right? And how can we say that? How can we tell the population of Britain that it is our critique that is the correct critique? It is our critique that speaks to your grievances most clearly and most persuasively.
Any more questions? We have 10 more minutes.
Well, if you have time. So I think I agree with my colleague here that it's not just 2001 where Islamophobia starts, it's in the Iranian Revolution.
Okay, yeah, of course, sorry, yes.
So it is the 70s. And you are quite right that there's been this whole trajectory from blackness. But my point was not about that. The way you articulated it made me feel it's always reactive to what the state, how the state frames you. And my question is from the feminist movement, whether blackness also hides. And that is coming up a lot in different areas now, which is like blackness is increasingly being associated with slavery and slave experience rather than African experience.
Okay, yeah.
And that, is it accurate to say the problems faced by women in the Middle East or women in South Asia are the same as so on? There are more complex issues involved there. I was also really interested in, because I've done that in my own work, my name is Shireen Rai, by the way, and I teach here at SOAS, is about the state and the kind of complexity that you mentioned towards the end of your talk, which is the kind of in and against the state approach, which the Edinburgh Marxist group wrote about, like, again, in the 70s. So some of those debates need to be retrieved. You might say that it doesn't come back, but I think it never left as a thing. So, and again, a lot of feminist literature does point to that in order to move, for example, from representativeness to substantiveness in parliaments, you need to be able to mobilize both the state as well as the community, right? Which is what you were saying. So I was just quite interested that that debate is still going on, and it should go on, because otherwise the state doesn't respond either to these, the legal element of the Diego Garcia, for example, is so important, but it wouldn't have happened without the mobilization of those people.
100%.
So I think that's an important point.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's certainly, I definitely agree with you that identifying as black or Muslim cannot be reduced to simply a reaction to the latest iteration of how racism is being articulated or experienced, right? There are other complex social forces which lead to people choosing to identify as black or identifying as Asian or identifying as Muslim. What those I think those social forces are complex, right? I mean, there are lots of different ones. They might be related, if you were writing in the 1970s, it might be associated with certain forms of like music or culture, what have you, right? We might think of obviously religion today. There are lots of different like social processes which lead to people identifying in certain ways politically. And I guess connecting it to your second point about the ways in which blackness is articulated today. I mean, I think a lot of these articulations of blackness that I feel like you're getting at, which is kind of certain, liberal approaches to black feminism that we might associate with the most overused word in academia, right, which is intersectionality. I think are not just useless, but are very unhelpful. Because they create, number one, this straw man, which is, if you use this idea of, blackness or third worldism, you're saying we're all the same. And of course, that's what no one is saying, that no two human beings are the same, let alone entire populations or racialised categories of people or ethnic or national groups or anything like that. What it's attempting to do is identify a form of connectedness. It's thinking, how are these different forms of oppression connected to each other, historically, economically, politically, and what have you, right? It's thinking about those different forms of connectedness, and through thinking through those interconnected forms of oppression, thinking through how do we mobilise in resistance? How is our liberation bound up with the liberation of each other, right? Right, it's crucial for forms of solidarity. And yeah, I don't think these kind of like liberal iterations of so-called black feminism are really interested in kind of collective liberation or solidarity, to be kind of perfectly honest. This is why, you don't see Kimberly Crenshaw going to, the Palestine encampments, right? On the, outside her office, right? And so I think, there are critiques to be made, but for me, I think that the rise of fascism means that I'm almost not even thinking about these kinds of liberal approaches to blackness anymore. I feel like the urgency of anti-fascism, of colonialism and imperialism in the Middle East, of the climate crisis, are so urgent for me that I honestly haven't given a huge amount of thoughts to it. Maybe it's
political though, isn't it? And it's about solidarities that we build and don't build.
Yeah.
So I think that the urgency demands, sorry, I shouldn't be.
No, it's important. Yeah. I'll come back to the liberal thing, the institutional thing. Go on.
Just a quick question. So I'm a visitor, not academic. I find it fascinating, the use of language and how things have changed. I was born in 1977. So it's really interesting how some things have changed and some things haven't. But my question is around definitions, because what do we mean, like, fascism in 1977 as opposed to we're in 2025 now? What does it mean now? These categories, who's coming up with these categories and changing their meanings of the right, the far right? I saw the extreme far right in one thing, and then we've got fascism. Like, what is that? What does it mean? I don't understand these things.
No, it's a good point. I mean, there are lots of debates at the moment about whether what we're seeing is fascism, and you could probably tell in my talk I kind of quite lazily use the phrases fascism, proto-fascism, and the far rights more or less interchangeably. There are debates as to whether what we are seeing is fascism or not. It certainly isn't the fascism of the 1930s, but I think it certainly is fascistic in as far as there is a certain authoritarianism. There is a grassroots element, right, which is, I think, what really one of the defining features of fascism. There has to be a grassroots movement, whether it's a kind of, I think I referred to it recently with a friend as kind of like astroturf fascism, right? Because a lot of the what appears to be grassroots movement is actually quite top down, right? It's being funded by billionaires, right? And it's instead of actually having like a KKK militia, you've actually got like ICE, right? They're basically the fascist militia, which is obviously very top down. So something different is certainly happening here, but there is certainly that element to it, right? And of course we have our kind of insiders and outsiders, right? We both have our enemies at the gates, but of course we have our enemies within, right? So of course no longer the unions because we crush them, but it's trans people, right? Or it's the people at these hotels who have snuck in somehow or been let in by the Liberals and the Labour Party or what have you. So for me, these are the kind of defining features, right? It's this authoritarian kind of ostensibly anti-establishment, anti-liberal establishment. It's the grassroots nature of it. And it's, the identification of outsiders and insiders, and quite total solutions to dealing with that. With those divisions. But yeah, the final point, I probably have to run away after this, is that, the thing about liberal institutions is that liberalism has this broad back, right? Which means that we can utilise and exploit openings and cracks and opportunities within liberal institutions. I mean, that's why we're here having this conversation in a liberal institution right now, right? It's because opportunities arise within liberalism, right? Which, if we're good Marxists, say that we need liberal modernity to realise its promise, right, of freedom, which of course it doesn't, right? So yes, and similar kind of liberal opportunities show themselves potentially in the courtroom to defend ourselves, right, in particular circumstances, and it's about in and against the state and its institutions, I think is an important strategy. And I think clearly one of the other things at the moment is the fascists have a powerful electoral strategy at the moment as well. And in and against the state, therefore, necessitates us having oh God, let's not go down this depressing road. We also need a decent electoral anti-fascist strategy, which at the moment is markedly absent, right? And so again, this is in and against the state. And, despite all of, the fact that all these overtures to quite militant anti-fascist resistance that I've talked about today, obviously I was like door knocking for Corbyn in 2019 with everybody else, because I understood the urgency of being, in and against the state in that, through that particular opportunity as well. But yeah, thank you so much for all your contributions. These are very, very new and unreconstructed thoughts, so I appreciate your patience with my slightly rambling thoughts and responses to your questions.
No, thank you so much, Adam. I mean, this is basically a workshop, so the idea was that you would present whatever you're thinking about, and just, So thank you so much for presenting, for taking the time. I know you're quite pressed on time. Thank you all for coming as well and engaging.